Respected Professor Sonti, Chairperson Dr. Mathur, Secretary Mr. Justin Mohan, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I've actually anchored the small talk of mine in the academic domain of socio-ecology, not so much only to highlight the human dimension of conservation, but track and trace the kind of legacy issues that have plagued the Eastern Ghats, which have contributed to denudation, degradation, and the lack of attention thereof. As Professor Nandini mentioned, I am from the town of Tirupati and I've spent many years there. And more recently, I had the privilege of drafting the ecological management plan for IIT Tirupati campus. But despite that, one may ask, why have you chosen to talk about the Eastern Ghats of Tamil Nadu? The next slide, please. For the simple reason that much of my work has been in Tamil Nadu and I'm more confident about talking about Tamil Nadu, but also about the fact that there was a time in history when human beings were not as narrow-minded as we are today. And in fact, the early Tamil kingdom was defined as something that stretched from Tiruvengadam in the north, which is Tirumala Tirupati in the north, to Kanyakumari in the south, and it was bounded by the seas on the east and west. This early reference is actually from the Tolkappiyam, in fact, from the Paramparanar preparatory verse. And this very clearly highlights that people in those days at least had a larger and a much holistic understanding of landscapes. The next slide, please. Now, what essentially are we talking about when we talk about Western Ghats or Eastern Ghats? We are essentially talking about the hills of peninsular India. But unfortunately, we were classified into the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats by the British, given their penchant for dichotomous classification, essentially for ease of administration. And this entire classification was based on a survey that was taken up by a gentleman called Alexander Reed, a geographer who commenced his study in 1792 and ended up in 1800. This was a survey called the Geographical Survey of the Madras Presidency. It was based on this that the hills were classified into Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats. And in fact, it was Reed's work along with Thomas Munro, which contributed to the land tenurial system. The kind of arrangements that the British put in place for land tenurial systems was also based on this particular survey. As I earlier mentioned, much of the classification that the British brought in was dichotomous. You had Eastern Ghats and Western Ghats, you had productive lands and wastelands. It goes on like that. You had tribes and you had non-tribes. This kind of classification is what we are stuck with as a legacy, and much of our problems are because of this dichotomous classification, which is actually in contrast to the kind of a more broad-ranging kind of a classification that we had in place for time immemorial. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. If you really look at how we classified landscapes, we as an Indians classified landscapes, we had multiple designations because we believe that multiple designations are essential to capture the diversity and also to make sure that whatever we intervene with is apt and just. When you really look at the kind of dynastic-based classification of the Tamil region, the early Tamil region, which is from Kumari to Kanyakumari, from Tiruvengadam to Kanyakumari, and bounded by the seas on the east and west. So it essentially all the 4 states of South India, 5 states of South India. If you really look at it, when you look at the classification based on dynasties, it was classified into 5 great regions. The Tolkappiyam actually classified the region based on dialects, the kind of languages and the dialects that people spoke, into 13 Nadus. They call them Nadus. In fact, we still retain that in Tamil Nadu. Nadu is a classification that's based on dialect. When it comes to landscape features, in fact, this is something that's talked about a lot. It's something that we derive out of the Tolkappiyam, where we talk about the Tinai system. Erroneously, people talk about it having classified the area into 5, which is not true. The kind of ecological wisdom that ancient Tamils had classified the landscapes into 4 cultural landscapes. They did not even call it ecological landscapes. They called it cultural landscapes because for each landscape type, they had designated a human being, his livelihood, the kind of birds that you find there, the kind of mammals you find there, the plants, the avocation, everything. So it was a very dynamic system. It was a 4-point classification, and the 5th one was a condition. It was a condition that denoted degradation, denudation. In fact, if you look at how Palai, the arid zone, was defined, it is not so much a kind of a landscape-based kind of a thing, but more a condition. And the nominate deity was a person who was almost similar to Kali. very aggressive, bloodthirsty kind of a deity is who they classified as the nominate deity for the condition that is something that we refer to as semi-arid to arid today. There was also a classification that was based on wildlife. This is something that people do not know much about, and this is something that we capture from folklore. And this has been written about extensively by a person called, by an anthropologist called Brenda Beck. And this is the story of the three brothers. This is something that you will find if you do some decent amount of field research in Tamil Nadu. You will find this coming in from various places. The story is as follows. There were three brothers who went on a hunt, and the animal that they hunted is very type specific, very locality specific. For instance, in the Javadi hills of the Tamil Nadu, they talk about this cheetal. When you actually talk to people in Satyamangalam, which is in the interface between what we now call the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats, people talk about the black buck. When you talk to people in Koli Hills, they say the animal that was chased was actually the wild boar. Most interestingly, in Mudumalai, the local Kurumbas say that they originated exactly based on this particular story, and that the animal that they tried to hunt was the sambar. So this common story actually is very wildlife specific, and based on where you hear it from, you can actually identify the most charismatic species. That is the kind of depth of understanding that people brought in those times. Then, of course, you have what is now designated as the Congo region. If you really look at Congo region, the reason I picked up Congo region is because it demonstrates the point that I'm making, that there is nothing called Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats in ancient society. It was hills of peninsular India. The Congo region actually was bounded by 49 hills, the northernmost of it being Kolli Hills. This is a designation that we get from a work by Aroke Sami in 1952. Next slide, please. I'm focusing a bit on Kolli Hills, not only because it's a very fascinating range of hills, but also because I did my thesis, my doctoral thesis from this landscape way back in the 90s. If you really look at Kolli Hills, Professor Pulaya showed a slide where the altitude was mentioned as 1,500 meters above sea level, the highest point in Kolli Hills, very accurate. The structural resemblance of the high elevation forests and the floral and faunal affinity of this particular place very clearly demonstrate that it's a biogeographical relic. It has shared endemic species with the Western Ghats, some of which have been mentioned here, a plant, an amphibian, and some birds have been mentioned here. We have not, of course, mentioned the more recent records that we have put. We've been able to cull out of this place. But what is more interesting is the kind of evidence that we get from history. In fact, Short in 1870, in one of the gazetteers mentions the presence of a large number of hornbills. And the earliest missionary to this place, Jessamine Brand, in 1910, records the presence of sloth bears. In fact, he even records the areas, the forest within Kolli Hills where these sloth bears are known to frequent. Pit vipers have been recorded in good numbers by Ramaswamy in 1967. All this demonstrating the affinity of Kolli Hills to the Western Ghats. If we can still sort of talk about it as Eastern Ghats and Western Ghats, it's just a kind of a corridor, a kind of a connectivity that exists between these two places. Next slide, please. The misnomers actually are not typical only to the hills. It's not just the hills and the landscape that the British classified into a dichotomous system, leading to a lot of problems, but also the people who dwelled in this area. Castes and tribes was a favorite kind of a designation that the British used to divide us, to make sure that we were treated as two distinct entities. The biggest problem in the Tamil Nadu part of the Eastern Ghats is the designation of a large number of tribal groups into two categories, Malayalis and Irula. So if you read through recent literature, it will always begin by saying these are numerically the largest group of tribes who are found in Tamil Nadu. The fact of the matter is a number of tribes were clubbed together into two distinct categories, making them or giving them this artificial designation of being numerically the largest. They are very distinct. In fact, anthropological evidence provides evidence to the fact that the Malayali is not the Malayali of Kerala. This is hill dwellers. Malay is hill, Ali is dweller. The hill dwelling tribe of these four ranges, at least Kolli, Shavarai, Pachai, and Javadu, are very distinct. There's no commonality between them except that they have been all put into one category. So, the research also has suffered. If you studied one Malayali group in one hill range, people tend to extrapolate it to other ranges, much to the disservice of the people who are living there and the kind of conservation traditions that they've had. What is also suppressed by this kind of a misnomer is the fact that these people have a traceable kind of a lineage beginning with the early tribals were the Vedas. The Vedas are the hunter tribes from whom the Malavars came in. And then, of course, the Malavars, along with the Vellalars, were the agrarian community, constituted the large number of people, the tribal people that we see as, today we see as Malayalis. What is also very interesting about Kolli Hills is the fact that it has an affinity to Kerala. It has an affinity to Kerala by way of the dynastic classification. Kolli Hills was a minor capital of the Chera kingdom, which also tells us that there should have been or would have been some kind of a cross-fertilization of thoughts, of conservation traditions. Much of what you see in Kerala can also be observed in Kolli Hills in terms of traditions. In fact, there is this very famous king called Kulasekara Alvar, who's also a Vaishnava saint. Kolli Hills was his minor capital. In fact, when I was doing my doctoral work, much of the literature that I referred to came from the Nalayara Divya Prabandham, where there were very clear evidences, very clear ideas about the landscape features of Kolli Hills. Next slide, please. More recently, during the British time, we've had committees such as the Ayyappan Committee. Ayyappan was the commissioner of museums of the Madras Presidency, and then there was this Aboriginal Tribes Welfare Committee, which designated Malayalis as non-agency tribal. The Ayyappan Committee is very, very pertinent to what we are discussing today. It talks about the kind of similarities, the kind of convergence that exists between all the tribal groups of Peninsular Hills in Peninsular Hills, but also talks about the kind of distinct identities and the distinct conservation traditions that these people, these communities have. This particular committee makes a recommendation saying, please carve out a kind of a program that takes into consideration the conservation traditions of the tribal groups. It talks about the need to recognize the diversity of forest types that exist in the Eastern Ghats, and it talks about the need to promote development with caution. In fact, it puts the word development within quotes. So a report like this in 1942, I think, is something that we really have to celebrate. The sad part of it is none of this was followed, and of course, we came up with our own set of programs and policies that today have contributed to much of the area being disseminated. The Malayalis of Salem, Trichy, and North Orkot, interestingly, were under the Royatwari system of revenue administration. The Malayalis of South Orkot, especially Javadi Hills, were under the polyglot system. This is something that friends from the Forest Department would very well align to, because it is this which continues to plague the kind of settlement issues that we have in Kalrayan Hills and Javadi Hills even today. This was something that was put in place by the British, and even today we are suffering because of this. And many researchers who worked in Kalrayan vouch for this, that the kind of degradation and land grabbing that goes on there is phenomenal, and nothing much can be done about it, primarily because we have these legacy issues. Richards, Hemingway, Thurston, and Rangachari Lefanu categorically state the distinction between Malayalis of various hills. But unfortunately, till today, we've not paid heed to this kind of an assessment, or not the need to distinguish and make distinct interventions amongst the tribes of the Eastern Ghats of Tamil Nadu. Next slide, please. I would always say the Eastern Ghats are actually forests of a lesser god in comparison to the Western Ghats. And I would like to stick to this kind of a very strong statement, primarily because when actually the British were trying to colonize southern India, one of the records of the company, which we tracked from the state archives, clearly mentions the need to capture the Salem-Baramahal district. In fact, there is a mention saying this is a point, or this is a landscape that we have to intervene in first in terms of capture, primarily because the land tenure systems there are amorphous, and it will give us a good grip in terms of trying to bring control over it. We can actually take control. This is a line that you actually see in a correspondence during the East India Company time. In fact, what they also brought in very effectively in the Salem-Baramahal regions, where Tirupati was the capital, was the restriction of existing forest rights. I firmly believe that this is what contributed to the entire landscape becoming a kind of a absolute control under the British kind of a system. And then, of course, what is not very much known, in contrast to the forests of the Western Ghats being degraded for railway sleepers and construction of cities of Coimbatore, and the kind of World War I supply where grasslands were denuded and grass was shipped to Egypt and other places by the British. In Eastern Ghats, especially in and around Kolli Hills, there was large-scale prospecting of iron ore, Kanjimalai, Tirthamalai, Kollimalai beds. And there was also a kind of a company that was established by a person called Thomas Holland in 1830 with absolute freedom to extract as much timber as possible from the forests of the Salem Baramahal region. This not only destroyed the forest very rapidly, but also contributed to the local knowledge being degraded. Now, why was the iron ore industry established there? The fact that it was available may be the most apparent reason, but also the availability of skilled labor. Virtually, this was something that the British got on a platter and they exploited it to the hill. Sandalwood dwelling also went about in this place without any question. It was rampant, so much so that when finally assessments had to be made, all that there were left were some stands heavily infested with spikes. Next slide, please. If you really look at conservation traditions and practices, I'm actually trying to summarize about 25 years of my work into a few slides. So I may come across as being very terse and very, ad hoc. Please bear with me on that. Eventually, when I do get to write a paper on this, maybe it may have far more detail. Until 1900, Kolli Hills was the only hills in the Baramal district where wet cultivation is practiced. So that's the kind of agrarian knowledge and conservation tradition that these hills have, none of which have been factored in. There's enormous diversity of minor millets. Professor Pulaya also spoke about minor millet diversity in that area. But what is also not very well known is there were 17 cultivars of banana. In fact, the Francis Gazetteer of Salem in the 1900s speaks about these 17 cultivars and the places where they are found. And it in fact states that the banana diversity of Kolli Hills is only next to Kanyakumari. But today, if you go to Kolli Hills, all that you see is just two varieties of banana, both hybrids and imports. The local cultivars are totally gone. But in 1990, 93, when I was working there, we were able to trace at least 6. But today, you don't find any of it there. The other aspect that has not been recognized or looked into or captured or documented is the kind of ethno-veterinary tradition that the Kolli Malayalis have. In fact, the British cavalry used to be totally supported by the kind of traditional medicine, ethno-veterinary practitioners that the Kolli Hills had. And there is a record which says that these people were actually taken to these stables for the horses and other animals to be treated by the Kolli Malayalis. The kind of formulations that they used were also indicated, but of course, we have no idea as to what these formulations were and what kind of practices went into developing these and what kind of surgical procedures that the Kolli Malayalis knew. Interestingly, when I was doing my work, I also found that birth spacing was something that the Kolli Malayalis effectively practiced by using a combination of contraceptives and also medication. Well, of course, at that point of time, neither did I have the bandwidth nor the kind of access to document it. But I really have serious doubts as to whether it's still prevalent. Because some of the practices that the Kolli Malayalis have when it comes to childbirth will today be termed as also very cruel and illegal. Because they have this practice of abandoning children when they find that the children are weak, just like the animals. They abandon the newborns if they designate them or if they find them to be a bit weak into the forest. And in fact, the early missionary presence in the Kolli Hills was primarily to make sure that these children were rescued and given a life. Next slide, please. So what are the misdemeanors? A number of misdemeanors, starting with the lack of research in this area, lack of attention to this area, because primarily people prefer to go to the Western Ghats, and more recently I find people don't even prefer the Western Ghats, they prefer the Northeast. Because we are always chasing down the more charismatic landscapes, charismatic animals, the mega mammals, points of origin of rivers, none of which Kolli Hills, at least, Eastern Ghats currently has. The kind of diversity that Eastern Ghats has is still very hidden and it's not very attractive to researchers. Unfortunately, that is the case. But the kind of misdemeanors that the system put in place begins with malaria eradication and use of DDT. This is something that the local people have repeatedly mentioned in all the hill ranges of Eastern Ghats and Tamil Nadu that we've researched on, saying that was a kind of a watershed kind of a period where much of the kind of totemic species that they had, the kind of sacred landscapes that they had, the kind of sacred groves that they had, were all compromised upon because they were used for malaria eradication. The second program that actually played havoc with these easterly hills, especially Kolli Hills, was the Integrated Tribal Development Program and the kind of large area multipurpose societies that they brought in. Because these two effectively made sure that the agrarian fabric, agrarian template of the place was totally changed into a horticulture-based, cash crop-based kind of a system. From a system where you had enormous diversity of minor millets, in fact, all four major minor millets, as well as fruit-bearing crops, you were shifted to a tapioca and pineapple-based kind of a system, which played havoc. This also contributed to a large number of forests being encroached upon, because if you really look at Kolli Hills, it's like a piece of cake. The top part of it is flat and it has a lot of shola forest, but the slopes are all where the reserve forests are. And people use the growing of tapioca very effectively to encroach or attempt to encroach upon the reserve forest area. The next system that actually brought in a lot of havoc, at least around the Shola forest, is the bauxite mining that went on until the department stepped in big time and made sure this was stopped. But it went on effectively for a little over 16 to 20 years, completely degrading the top portion of the hill. In fact, you have craters there where there used to be tall trees, Shola forest. Then the horticulture missions that have been put in place. These horticulture missions have really played havoc with the place, essentially focusing only on 2 or 3 horticulture crops. They made sure that the diversity of the area was totally compromised upon. Finally, of course, universal PDS. From a system where you had millet-based diets, when you forced communities to go in for a rice-based diet, a lot of conservation traditions were lost. In fact, one of the things that we studied was looking at the knowledge systems across generations, and we found that even in Kolli Hills, a place which is actually in the lap of nature, the younger generation had absolutely no idea about the kind of diversity they have. We, in fact, did an assessment where we showed a series of pictures of birds that are typical to the region. While the senior citizens were able to identify all of them, the younger generation was able to identify at best 4 to 5 species. This is the kind of loss that we find. So more recently, when we had the opportunity to actually go into the same regions to look into the PBRs, the kind of work that the People's Biodiversity Registers are being drafted with, we found the same kind of a scenario. In fact, when we asked to name some animals that are typical to the region, people name the animals like rhinoceros and hippopotamus. That's the kind of knowledge erosion that you see happening in this place. So in summary, what we are saddled with is the kind of legacy issues that were put in place largely during the colonial rule of India. Eastern Ghats thankfully was, no, I shouldn't say Western Ghats was thankfully spared a bit, but Eastern Ghats actually bore the brunt of this kind of legacy issues. And I think it's time we correct this, or at least make attempts to make sure that we research into it and come up with means by which this kind of a lacuna, this kind of shortcoming is overcome. Thank you.